before emperors ruled Rome, before the empire stretched from Britannia to the sands of Arabia. There was a man whose ambition rewrote history, Gaius Julius Caesar, a general, a reformer, a dictator, a name that echoed through the ages. But who was he, really? A genius, or a tyrant, a visionary, or the destroyer of a republic? Today we trace the hidden thread of Caesar's life, from obscurity to omnipotence, from glory to betrayal. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of our Age of Caesar series. This is where it begins, with Julius Caesar himself. Over the next few episodes, we'll paint the bigger picture, exploring not just Caesar, but the men and women around him, in moments of triumph and in tragedy. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Julius Caesar was born in July 100 BCE, the month that would one day bear his name. He entered a world ruled by ancient customs and elite families. His own, the Julii, claimed descent from Aeneas, the legendary Trojan hero, and through Aeneas, they traced their bloodline all the way to the goddess Venus. But a mythical pedigree meant little in a republic crumbling from within, fractured by corruption and rival factions. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, held a respectable but modest position, first as praetor, then as governor of the province of Asia. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, came from old aristocracy. She was sharp, politically savvy, and deeply respected. Many historians credit her as one of the strongest influences in Caesar's early life. Despite their noble name, however, the Julii were not wealthy. Caesar grew up in the Subura, a noisy, crowded, working-class district of Rome. It was rough, but it was also very real. He saw poverty and power living side by side, and he never forgot it. That contrast would shape the way he saw Rome, and later, fuel the bond he built with the common people. Shortly after Caesar turned 16, his father died unexpectedly, making him the head of the family. At the same time, Rome itself was spiraling, locked in a brutal power struggle. Two giants clashed, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was a brilliant general, a champion of the lower classes. He led the populares, a movement fighting for reform and for Rome's poor. And Marius was Caesar's uncle by marriage. Sulla, on the other hand, stood for the optimates, the conservative elite who clung to the Senate's authority. Their rivalry exploded into civil war. Sulla won and declared himself dictator. That made Caesar a marked man. He was too close to Marius. Worse, he had married Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, Marius's key ally. To Sulla, the marriage was a threat. He ordered Caesar to divorce her. Caesar refused. It was unthinkable. A teenage boy, defying a dictator. Without hesitation, Sulla responded with fury, stripping Caesar of his inheritance and priesthood, forcing him into hiding. For months, Caesar was forced to live on the run, moving constantly, surviving on the loyalty of friends and family. But Caesar wasn't alone. He had allies, powerful ones. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred priestesses, joined forces with relatives on his mother's side, pleading for his life. Sulla at last relented, but he gave a warning. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. Exiled and stripped of his future, Caesar turned to the only path left, the military. He was sent east to serve under the Roman commander Marcus Thermus. And it didn't take long for Caesar to stand out. In 81 BCE, the city of Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos, rebelled against Rome. Caesar joined the campaign to crush the uprising, and in the thick of battle, he distinguished himself. He was awarded the civic crown, the Corona Civica, one of Rome's highest military honors. Made from oak leaves, it was given to soldiers who saved the life of another Roman in combat. It could be worn for life, and even senators were required to stand in the presence of the wearer. For someone so young, it was extraordinary. But to Caesar, it meant more than a medal. It was proof that he was destined for more than survival. He was born for greatness. After Mytilene, Caesar didn't just return with honors. He returned with a taste for glory, for power, and perhaps for the first time, with the idea that maybe Rome itself was not too big to conquer. When Sulla died in 78 BCE, reportedly from liver failure, maybe sped up by syphilis, heavy drinking, or sheer stress, Rome didn't mourn. His brutal dictatorship had left scars. But for Caesar, Sulla's death meant something else, a chance to come home. He returned to Rome determined to climb the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman political offices. And he wasn't just ambitious, he was relentless. He started by mastering the art of persuasion. Caesar traveled to Rhodes to study under Apollonius Molon, one of the most respected orators in the Greek world. Molon had even taught Cicero. Caesar didn't just want to be loud, he wanted to be unforgettable. And he was. His voice, his presence, his delivery. He knew how to work a crowd like no one else. But speeches alone couldn't win Rome. You needed influence, and influence meant money. To win public favor, Caesar spent big: gladiator games, feasts, theatrical shows. He went deep into debt to fund them all. Rome loved a showman, and Caesar knew it. His debts piled up, but he wasn't worried. Wealthy backers like the powerful Crassus saw potential, and possibly a future ally. In 69 BCE, Caesar was elected quaestor, the first official step on the ladder. He was sent to Hispania, modern-day Spain. He was about 31. There, he learned more than accounting. He studied how provinces were managed, how taxes were extracted, and how military power could be quietly turned into political power. When he returned to Rome, he was sharper, better connected, and ready for the next move. In 65 BCE, he became aedile, overseeing public buildings and games. This was Caesar in his element, entertaining the people, building monuments, raising his public image. The crowds adored him. The elites? Not so much. His spending was wild. His debts were now legendary. But it worked. 2 years later, in 63 BCE, he shocked the political establishment by winning election as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. It came with status, a grand residence, and massive religious authority. Many thought he was too young, too in debt, too radical. But Caesar had the votes and perfect timing. In 62 BCE, he became praetor, just one step below consul. After his term, he was given the governorship of Hispania Ulterior, further Spain. He was 38. It was his first true independent command. There, Caesar led military campaigns against local tribes. He won battles, took towns, enriched the treasury. His soldiers admired him. His creditors got their payments, and Rome took notice. It was during this time that Caesar visited a statue of Alexander the Great. He stood before it silently, then wept. Alexander had conquered half the known world by age 30. Caesar was nearly 40 and hadn't even reached consul. But it wasn't jealousy. It was fuel. He would catch up. He would surpass him. And he would reshape Rome to do it. This was no longer about politics. This was about legacy. Back in Rome, Caesar was a man on the edge of greatness. But to rise any further, he needed more than money or popularity. He needed power. And in Rome, power often meant partnership. Enter Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey was the golden boy of the Roman military. Tall, charismatic, undefeated. He'd crushed pirates, ended Spartacus's slave revolt, and expanded Rome's reach in the east. He was beloved by his troops and feared by the Senate. Crassus was his opposite, more businessman than general. But he was the richest man in Rome, with wealth built through real estate schemes, slave trading, and fire brigades that offered rescue for a price. What he lacked in fame, he made up for in gold. Caesar brought what neither of them had: the people. Together, the three formed an informal alliance, a triumvirate, not an official body, but a private pact to control the republic. Each man got something out of it. Pompey wanted land for his veterans. Crassus wanted tax breaks for his allies. And Caesar? He wanted the consulship, the highest office in Rome. The Senate was outraged. They saw it as a hostile takeover. Three men bypassing the republic for personal gain. But the triumvirate had what mattered: votes, money, and muscle. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. His year in office was bold, chaotic, unapologetically Caesar. He pushed through land grants for Pompey's troops, tax reforms for Crassus, and populist laws that made him even more beloved by the people. When the Senate resisted, he bypassed them, taking laws directly to the citizens. He didn't just bend the rules, he rewrote them. One of his loudest critics was Marcus Tullius Cicero, a master orator who hated Caesar's disregard for tradition. But Caesar wasn't playing the old game anymore. His methods earned him enemies. Fights broke out in the Senate. His co-consul, Bibulus, tried to stop him, then gave up, stayed home, and claimed the omens were bad. The joke in Rome? It wasn't the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus. It was the consulship of Julius and Caesar. During this time, Caesar also began mentoring a bold young officer, Mark Antony. Brash, loyal, and fearless, Antony stood out. Their bond was just beginning, but it would grow into something Rome would never forget. By the end of his consulship, Caesar had achieved everything he wanted. But it came at a cost. The Senate saw him as reckless. The optimates whispered about tyranny. But to the people? He was a champion. Bold, unafraid, effective. He was loved. He was feared. And, most dangerously, he was indispensable. Rather than stay and face his enemies in Rome, Caesar secured a 5-year proconsulship in Gaul. Officially, he was going to protect Roman interests. Unofficially, he was about to become a legend. Gaul was a patchwork of tribes, alliances, and ancient grudges. a vast, wild land stretching from the Alps to the Atlantic. It was rich in resources, strategically vital, and, to Rome, perpetually unstable. For Caesar, it was something else entirely, the proving ground of a lifetime. He arrived in 58 BCE as proconsul, but not as a mere administrator. He came with legions, seasoned soldiers ready for war, and war is exactly what they found. The campaigns began with the Helvetii, a migrating tribe attempting to move west. Caesar defeated them swiftly, decisively, but it was just the start. Over the next 8 years, he fought dozens of battles, crushed uprisings, brokered alliances, and pushed Roman influence deeper into Gaul than ever before. His soldiers adored him. He shared their hardships, led from the front, and rewarded loyalty. He called them comrades instead of men. This was no empty gesture. Caesar's legions didn't just fight for Rome, they fought for him. But his wars weren't without controversy. Entire towns were burned, tens of thousands killed. Some of his tactics, even by Roman standards, were brutal. After the siege of Avaricum, nearly every inhabitant, men, women, and children, was slaughtered. And yet, Caesar framed each campaign as a preemptive defense, a necessary act to secure Rome's borders. Back in Rome, his reports, his famous Commentarii de Bello Gallico, were published regularly. Written in clear, third-person prose, they read like dispatches from a hero. But make no mistake, they were propaganda, crafted to shape public opinion and maintain his image. And then came Vercingetorix. Young, charismatic, and fiercely intelligent, Vercingetorix united the Gallic tribes in a revolt. He was everything Caesar's past enemies had failed to be: a unifier, a strategist, and a master of guerrilla warfare. Their final confrontation came at Alesia. Caesar's legions besieged the city. But then, a second Gallic army arrived, trapping the Romans between two forces. It should have been the end. But Caesar did the impossible. He built a second ring of fortifications to fight off the outside army while continuing the siege inside. The battle lasted weeks. Supplies ran low, morale dipped, and still Caesar held the line. Eventually, the outer Gallic forces broke. Inside the city, Vercingetorix surrendered. It was Caesar's greatest military triumph, and one of Rome's most legendary battles. By 50 BCE, Gaul was subdued. The region was pacified and under Roman control. Caesar had expanded Rome's borders, won the loyalty of 10 hardened legions, and amassed incredible wealth. But in Rome, not everyone was cheering. His enemies in the Senate watched with unease. Caesar's popularity had grown. His army was fiercely loyal, and his reports had made him into a myth. He had left Rome as a controversial figure. He returned in the minds of many as a god of war. His alliance with Crassus and Pompey? Cracking. Crassus had been killed in 53 BCE during a disastrous campaign in Parthia, his greed for glory ending in disaster. Pompey, once Caesar's closest ally, had grown distant. He stayed in Rome, aligning more with the Senate, suspicious of Caesar's power. And Mark Antony? He had joined Caesar in Gaul and distinguished himself in battle. Charismatic and brave, Antony became one of Caesar's most trusted officers. Their bond, commander and protege, would grow even stronger in the years ahead. Caesar had conquered Gaul. But now, he faced a far more dangerous battlefield: Rome. The peace couldn't last. After nearly a decade of conquest in Gaul, Caesar had become too powerful and too popular for the Senate's comfort. His victories were staggering, his wealth enormous, his legions unshakably loyal. Meanwhile, the alliance that once held Rome together had collapsed. Crassus was dead, his Parthian campaign a catastrophe, and Pompey, once Caesar's partner in power, had drifted toward the Senate, wary of his old friend's growing fame. The balance had shifted. Pompey now stood as champion of the Republic, while Caesar was painted as a rising tyrant. In 50 BCE, the Senate issued an ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he refused, he would be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar hesitated. He had only one legion with him. The 13th Legion, around 5,000 to 6,000 men. But they were veterans, hardened, loyal. He knew that crossing into Italy with an armed force was treason. But returning without one would mean humiliation, or worse. So, on a winter night in January 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. "Alea iacta est," he said. The die is cast. The Republic would never be the same. Pompey and most of the Senate fled south, then east, regrouping in Greece. Caesar swept through Italy, almost unopposed. Cities surrendered. Crowds cheered. The people wanted peace, and remembered who had fed them, employed them, and entertained them. But Caesar knew that political power could not rest on sentiment. So he pursued Pompey across the Adriatic. In 48 BCE, at the want battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's outnumbered army crushed Pompey's. His veterans fought with ruthless precision. Pompey's forces, many of them green, broke and fled. Pompey escaped to Egypt, seeking asylum. But the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, hoping to curry favor with Caesar, had him murdered on arrival. Caesar arrived days later. When he was presented with Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Rival or not, Pompey had been his son-in-law, his ally, his equal, once. In Egypt, Caesar became entangled in the civil war between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra VII. She was brilliant, magnetic, and politically cunning. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra seized power. Their alliance became personal and produced a son, Caesarion. But Caesar could not linger. Across the Roman world, Pompeian forces still resisted. In 46 BCE, he fought the remnants of the opposition in North Africa. The Battle of Thapsus was savage. Caesar's forces won, but the cost was high. Cato the Younger, one of Caesar's fiercest ideological enemies, chose suicide rather than live in a world ruled by Caesar. Then in 45 BCE, he turned to Hispania, where Pompey's sons had rallied yet another army. At the Battle of Munda, Caesar nearly lost. It was his final campaign, and his most desperate. But in the end, victory was his. With Hispania subdued, the civil war was finally over. Mark Antony had proven himself throughout these years, as a general, a loyalist, and Caesar's right hand. He was no longer just a protege. He was a pillar of Caesar's power. Brutus, formerly on Pompey's side, had been spared and welcomed back. Caesar believed in mercy, or at least in the appearance of it. By now, Caesar wasn't just a victor. He was unrivaled. He returned to Rome in triumph. But Rome had changed, and so had he. There was no republic left, only Caesar. Alone. Caesar returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as something Rome had never quite seen before. A living legend with no rival, no equal, and now, no checks on his power. The Senate, outplayed and overwhelmed, officially appointed him dictator for life in the year 44 BCE. But their relationship with him had grown uneasy. Many senators still sat in their curule chairs only because Caesar had allowed it. Their positions were now favors, not entitlements. For some, that was humiliating. For others, terrifying. Caesar wasted no time. He launched a wave of reforms, expanding citizenship throughout the provinces, restructuring debt to ease the burden on the poor, and standardizing the Julian calendar. A solar system we still use today, with only minor adjustments. He packed the Senate with allies, veterans, and loyalists, inflating its numbers to over 900. To the common people, these changes were welcome. Bread was cheaper. Public works expanded. Festivals and games were held in his honor. He was celebrated, even worshipped. But to the Senate elite, he was starting to look less like a reformer and more like a monarch. He sat on a golden throne at public games. His image was stamped onto coins, something previously reserved for the gods. He wore the purple robes and laurel wreath of triumph every time he entered the forum. Some say he even flirted with kingship, though always with a carefully timed denial. At the festival of Lupercalia, Mark Antony offered Caesar a crown in front of the crowd. Caesar turned it down. But the moment lingered, like smoke before fire, and the fire was coming. Inside Caesar's inner circle, things were getting complicated. Mark Antony remained his closest lieutenant, loud, loyal, and ever-present. Brutus, once pardoned and reinstated, was now back in Rome's halls of power. Caesar treated him like a son. Maybe he believed that affection would buy loyalty. His son, Caesarion, was still a child in Egypt, under Cleopatra's protection. And in Rome, another figure was rising fast. Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew. Young, sharp, and watching everything. Some embraced the new Rome. Others believed they were watching the Republic die. In the shadows, whispers became meetings, and meetings became a plot. A group of senators, many of whom Caesar had spared, promoted, or honored, came to believe that by killing one man, they could save an entire system. They called themselves the Liberators, and they were preparing to strike. Julius Caesar had been dictator for less than a year when the knives came out. Many senators had reluctantly confirmed him as dictator for life, some out of loyalty, others out of fear, and many because they owed their careers to his appointments. On the morning of March 15th, in the year 44, he walked into the theater of Pompeii, where the Senate was set to meet. He was unarmed, unguarded, and either unaware of the danger or too confident to care. Waiting inside were more than 60 senators, all sworn to a single purpose. Among them, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, once allies, now leaders of a conspiracy. They called themselves the Liberators. They believed they were rescuing the Republic from a man who had already made himself king in everything but name. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Some say he fought back at first, until he saw Brutus among his attackers. Then he stopped resisting. Et tu, Brute? Whether he said it or not, the betrayal was real. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, a final, bitter irony. The conspirators expected to be hailed as heroes. They thought the Republic would cheer. But instead, Rome fell into shock, then into anger. The people, many of whom had benefited from Caesar's rule, mourned his death. Crowds gathered, Tensions rose. Rome hovered on the edge of chaos. Mark Antony, devastated and furious, gave the funeral oration. It was a masterclass in persuasion. He held up Caesar's blood-stained cloak. He read aloud his will, revealing Caesar had left money and land to the Roman people. The crowd turned. Grief became fury. They rioted. The homes of the assassins were attacked. Order collapsed. As for Brutus, his role shocked the city. Caesar had trusted him, treated him like a son. His motives are still debated, but guilt would follow him for the rest of his life. Cassius, by contrast, had always seen Caesar's rise as a threat to liberty. His resentment was no secret. In the East, word of Caesar's death sent ripples through the political world. In Egypt, Cleopatra and her son Caesarion suddenly found themselves exposed. Rome had become unpredictable. Old allies were gone. New enemies were on the rise. And then, there was Octavian, just 18 years old, Caesar's great-nephew, and, as revealed in the will, his adopted son and heir. In an instant, Octavian's life changed. He acted fast. He secured the will, gathered support from Caesar's veterans, and began moving through the political ranks. He wasn't just inheriting a name. He was claiming a legacy. He was no longer just a privileged youth. He was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and he had a claim, not just to Caesar's memory, but to everything he left behind. The Republic was bleeding, but the next chapter in Rome's story was just beginning. Caesar's assassination didn't save the Republic. It shattered it. In the power vacuum that followed, Rome spiraled into another civil war. On one side, Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general. On the other, Octavian, Caesar's teenage heir. They were allies at first, but ambition doesn't share. The conflict reached its climax in the year 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium. Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, who had become Antony's lover and political partner. A year later, both took their own lives. Caesarion, Caesar's only biological son, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. He was seen as too dangerous to live. In the new regime, there could be only one Caesar. With no rivals left, Octavian consolidated power. But he didn't call himself king. That word was still poison in Rome. Instead, in the year 27 BCE, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. He kept the name Caesar as a symbol of continuity, but Augustus marked the beginning of something new. A Rome that still called itself a republic, but no longer acted like one. It was a calculated move. He claimed to be restoring the old ways, while quietly ending them. Thus began the Roman Empire. Caesar's name lived on, not just in memory, but as a title. Caesar became shorthand for ruler, Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian. Long after his death, Caesar would shape languages, governments, even national identities. He was deified by the Roman state. Temples were built. His birthday became a public festival. Coins bore his image for generations. He wasn't just remembered. He was worshipped. His achievements in war, reform, and expansion gave weight to the myth. He became more than a man. He became a symbol. And as for those closest to him, Mark Antony died defeated, but not forgotten. His loyalty and downfall immortalized in plays and histories. Brutus and Cassius died by suicide after losing the battle at Philippi. Their dream of reviving the Republic died with them. Cleopatra chose death over capture, becoming a symbol of both seduction and tragedy. Caesarion, just a boy, was erased from history. Octavian ruled for decades as Augustus, Rome's first true emperor. Julius Caesar had lived as a general, ruled as a dictator, and died as a martyr. But more than anything, he became a symbol of ambition, of genius, and of the price of power. His death didn't end a story. It began a new world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition toppled a republic and whose shadow still stretches across history. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next episode of The Hidden Thread, where we follow the life and legacy of one of Caesar's most loyal and complex allies, Mark Antony. His loyalty, his love, and his fall from grace will echo across empires. This has been The Hidden Thread, where history is not just told, it is revealed.